Okay, let's go then. So hello everyone. It's McCready Musings here, and I'm joined by Anthony. Anthony, sorry, merged your names together there. Anthony and Andy from Lucky Paper Radio today. And we're going to be talking about Cube. So just hey guys, how's it
Hello.
going?
Great,
Nice
thanks
to
for
meet
having
you.
us.
Oh, no problem. Happy to have you. So I think essentially what I wanted to talk about was sort of misconceptions about the cube format. I know this is something you guys look at a lot on your podcast. I think there's sort of people, they have an idea of what cube is, which isn't quite what it is. And I think, I don't know, just if more people understood the format, more people would be interested in it, I guess. Is that what do you guys reckon?
I certainly think that more people should like Cube. Now, what the reason is that more people don't like it, I'm not sure. But to me, it's the best way to play Magic, bar none. And so, yeah, we're always kind of evangelizing the format to people because for some reason people don't realize it's the best format. So we got to work on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting format because it is so nebulous. It can be so many different things for so many different people, but at the same time, a lot of people see it through, or sort of their entry point is very uniform. You know, they're seeing just the Magic Online cubes. So people sort of develop a very specific impression of what it looks like, even though it can be so diverse.
Yeah, exactly. Which I guess brings me on to the sort of first cubing misconception. I think this is the sort of big misconception. If there's one thing, I guess I want people to take away from this, it's this. So I think the first sort of misconception people have about cubing is I think people think cube is this format where you should only use sort of the most powerful cards in the history of the game. And if you're not building something like the MTGO Vintage Cube or their Legacy Cube, then like you're cubing wrong. So you need to be using all these super powerful cards to cube properly.
Yeah, I mean,
So
this is a huge, huge topic, and is something that we talk about on our podcast basically all the time, sort of at least
yeah.
woven into every other discussion we're having. Cube definitely can be that, and that is what it is for a lot of players. One of the sort of initial ways that you might describe a cube is, well, it's like drafting, but all the cards are good. Instead of having, a bunch of commons, it's just like every card is a rare, and it's amazing. And that can be great, that can be a lot of fun, but I think it's really baked into the way that we talk about it that that's the only thing it can be, when really it can be whatever kind of custom draft format you want. You can really take it as an opportunity to support any kind of cards, play styles, whatever it really interests you about the game. But it's baked into the way we talk about it. We're like, well, this is a fine option until you upgrade, but really that's not that. You can not play with those cards and still have a great time.
Exactly, yeah. I think it's something that comes up a lot. Like people will be talking about cards online, whether they're like good cube cards or not good cube cards. I think you guys mentioned on your podcast a lot.
Extreme
About this. Yeah, like there's Mold Drifter or something. People are all saying like, no, like Mold Drifter isn't a cube card anymore. Like, why would you be running Mold? But like, if you want a Mold Drifter, you get a Mold Drifter. Like it can be whatever the sort of power level you want to set, I guess.
Right. I'm not sure how much to blame the Magic Online cube for that. I mean, blame is a weird word. I mean, they're just making their own
Good
thing.
point.
But the fact that the Magic Online Vintage Cube specifically is so many people's like perceptions of like quintessential like peak Magic. At least, when I first discovered what Cube was, I discovered it by watching pros play the Magic Online Vintage Cube, and it was like Vintage Cube is here. This is the best time of year. This is the best, week where we can draft the best format. And I was like, oh, everyone says this is the best format. Let's figure out why. And the modern cube and the legacy cube, and when they have other kinds of more novelty or like different kinds of cubes on Magic Online, they never get as much attention or press, I feel like, from pros and streamers as the vintage cube does. It kind of has this hallowed ground, this like this perception that I think contributes a lot to that.
I mean, because that is a compelling and exciting sort of log line for it.
I get to draft Black Lotus,
It's draft,
right?
but
Yeah.
you get to draft all these crazy things you don't get to draft in other contexts, whether that's like literally Black Lotus or just like the Storm deck, which you can't really do that in Constructed.
Yeah, and like the reasons this like misconception I think is so detrimental to what Cube can be is, one, I think it keeps some people out of the format that would have fun designing really different environments. But I think much more importantly, it I think imposes this perception of like you have to have a big budget to like play Cube, and you have to enjoy playing with these powerful cards. If you don't like drafting a Storm deck, then you're not going to enjoy playing Cube, because that's what the like broad perception is of what Cube is. And so for all those people that like don't enjoy that look at that and say, I don't have these expensive cards, I'm never going to, I'm not that invested in the game. I still think Cube is the best way for them to play Magic, because it's scalable with whatever level of investment you have, whatever kinds of cards you like. And that's the biggest thing for me. I don't actually think there's that many people being kept out of it that would enjoy designing novel formats. I think those are the people that actually do find Cube, or the people that are driven to design themselves and like make their own environment. It's the other people that maybe could care less or care a lot less about actually designing their own Cube, but they just want to play Magic with their friends. And Cube is the best way to do that if you know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Because I think that was sort of my experience when I was sort of learning about the format. I think I heard about Cube, but I was under the impression that it was sort of just, this incredibly high powered format and it was only kind of power optimized cards. And I sort of didn't necessarily understand the sort of curating aspect of it. And, you make your own environment, like it can be whatever you want it to be. And then once I sort of had realized that, like it seemed a lot more sort of appealing to me.
And like you said, that is woven through everything, right? Like even just calling something a cube card, like seems so innocuous and like how could that possibly matter? But that's the kind of thing that you hear about over and over again. This is a cube card. That's not a cube card. You're like, oh, there must obviously be some clear delineation of what a cube is, and some things fit and other things don't. And so all these little tiny languages and words we use and ways we describe things end up contributing to this feeling that cube has to be this powerful, eternal thing.
Yeah, and we definitely went through that sort of same sort of development in our own play group as well, where Andy sort of was the discoverer of cube in our play group and started with largely that, like, if a card is more powerful than another, play the more powerful version. And then we were sort of like, well, but there's all these other cards that we also want to play with that just don't really make sense here and don't really compete. Cube can be whatever we want it to be. Let's make another cube that has all these cards in it.
Now we have, I don't know, a dozen cubes in our play group.
I think more.
We have as many.
Oh, wow.
We have almost as many cubes as we have players in our play group at this point, which is a blessing and a curse.
So sort of every night, I guess, when you guys meet up, like you'd do a different cube, or you'd do sort of several cubes, or how would that sort of go?
Yeah, I mean, it's usually that. I would say most of our meetups with our local play group are like 2 cubes. We do 1 cube, we eat a meal, we do another cube. It tends to be the pattern we're following these days.
And would you sort of change, like maybe you'd play a sort of super high power cube first and then a sort of lower power cube later on? How do you sort of determine which ones you'd be going for?
Usually it's whoever was willing to host or cook that gets to decide which cubes are played. Yeah, I don't know. We just play whatever. I mean, that's the thing is I feel like there's a broad range of different players in our play group, obviously, and each different cube, for the most part, brings a different kind of challenge to a different kind of player. Like, some people are just like, I want to figure out how this environment works and ticks, and I want to win at all costs. And so, no matter what power level of the cube, right, like, that player still has something to get out of the experience. Trying to win the lowest power cube possible is still the same problem. It's the same puzzle. It's the same spiky mentality as trying to spike a really powerful cube. And similarly, there are some players that just want to do the things they like, and really, kind of in any cube, you can always discover the thing that you like about that cube, right? Even if it's not, what you would build an EDH deck about or whatever. There's always something for players to discover, no matter what the environment is.
Yeah, I think I sort of like that idea, I guess, if you mentioned, your play group, like everyone will have their own cube. And I guess that sort of shows, the diversity of the format. Everyone sort of curates their own environment and everyone can sort of experiment and they're all sort of playing around and they're also, discovering, what works for me? What do I enjoy about the game? What do I sort of want to bring out in my own kind of cube myself, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's... that's really one of the most wonderful things about the format. It's not just like, oh, you love this, so you'll build a commander deck that reflects that, and we can see how it works at the table. Everyone actually gets to play that. So you love gold cards, you design the cube that has only gold cards in it, and we all have to figure out how does that format work.
Yeah. Oh, cool. I think with that, I'll move on then to question number 2, or misconception number 2, I should say, which is that a cube, you've got to adhere to a rigid structure. All 10 of the color pairs must be viable, and you need to follow strict archetypes. So, you've got to have 5 dual color cards for every color pair, for instance.
Yeah, this is, I think, definitely a bit of a misconception, but I don't think it's really a harmful one per se. I think for a lot of players, it helps them know, like, what do I put in my cube? I have no idea where to start, and having an outline of like, oh, well, just start with 50 of each color card and 5, cards in each guild and 50 fixing lands or whatever. Yeah. Having that framework, I think, helps a lot of people get over that first hump of like, how do I even make a cube? And to be clear, like, I think Anthony and I are both in favor of anything that helps you get over that first hump of like, how to make a cube.
Yeah.
I think once you get more invested in designing a cube yourself, curating your own environment, and the actual design of that environment becomes a interesting problem for you to solve and something that you're compelled and interested in, and it's not all about the playing anymore, then I think there's a lot of arguments for abandoning that very rigid structure where you have like a template and you just kind of fill in the slots. And maybe you can talk more about why that doesn't always make sense, Anthony.
I would just say where it does become a detriment is where, like you're saying, if people to be following a rigid structure, if they're obligated to do that. So if a designer is working on a cube and they're thinking, well, there's not another Rakdos card that I really like, someone help me, like, this is a real struggle, just don't put in another Rakdos card. Or, it's totally fine to let things be a little bit asymmetrical and abandon that. Or, if you just don't like a color, you can just omit a color entirely and still have a fun environment. So that's where I think it can be problematic. But I do agree that if it can be sort of a template that gets people over some of the decision paralysis, it can be a benefit there as well.
This is one topic
right.
we do have an entire dedicated episode about. So if people want to hear more about this, I forget what number it is, but it's the podcast title is Use and Abuse of Archetype-Driven Design. So there's definitely a lot to unpack here, but generally it's like, yeah, if you feel like having a specific 2-color pairs and like archetypes and like very specific template to fill out is helpful for you, great. But inevitably, having talked with tons of people over the years and various Discord servers and Reddit and stuff about designing their cube, there comes a point where you're like, I have no more Rakdos cards, like Anthony said, that fit my theme. And it's like, okay, well, you can just put in a 5th card that doesn't actually fit your themes because there isn't one that exists, and that card will probably either not get played or will like look like it doesn't belong, or you just exclude it. And no one's going to see the entire cube when they're drafting it, right? Like no one's going to get to the end of the draft and be like, I'm Rakdos, where was my 5th Rakdos card? Because obviously some other player could have just taken it. That's how cube works. That's how draft works. So I think there's often this desire as a designer to have this symmetry and this like beautiful abstract structure and plan for your environment that you think will then mean it plays better or plays more balanced. And the reality is it doesn't affect really how it's played at all. That symmetry is for you, the designer, if you like it. But the actual experience of your cube is going to be a random 15-card packs with players taking cards out of them. And that experience, you can have a lot of asymmetry and imbalance aesthetically that then feels very balanced and symmetrical in that actual play experience.
Because they're not, going to see. Yeah, it's interesting as well that you should mention your episode on archetypes, because actually listening to that episode, which maybe came up with this question. But you're right. Perhaps misconception might be the wrong way of thinking about this. I suppose this is a structure which is there, and if you want to adopt it, that's great, that's fantastic, that works for you. But it's not kind of mandatory, I guess. Like, you can build a cube with this, you can build a cube without this.
I do think it's a misconception, but I think it's compared to the first one we talked about, which I think is a misconception that actively keeps people from adopting cube. I don't think this one has that like kind of negative like gatekeeping aspect to it. And if somebody that's never played cube before has that perception about cube, it's like, okay, fine, you can have that perception. I think when you start designing a cube, you'll probably pretty quickly abandon that approach because you'll find that it doesn't actually make a ton of sense.
Although I think there are areas that even very invested cube designers will stick to a very rigid structure. For example, lands. Lots of designers will just stick to, these are the most powerful lands. Let's have them evenly distributed so every color pair has the same amount. In my own environment, I have some colors that are much more proactive and aggressive, and I actually just have a lot more lands and much more efficient lands in those color pairs because I want the texture of the games to be different depending on what colors you're playing.
So I suppose, you sort of design the lands based on what those color pairs would sort of be looking for, rather than just having a uniform, I'll have the shock lands for every color pair.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And like for me too, I think there's really stark examples of that. Like the creature lands, for example, the 2-colored creature lands from Zendikar, the 2 different Zendikar sets. A broad range of power levels in those lands. And of course, depending on what your deck is doing, it may be more or less inclined to want a creature land. So like in my environment, I just have the blue-white one, Celestial Colonnade. That's the only creature land I have in the entire cube. It means that there's one more blue-white land than there are other lands in different guilds. And it doesn't come up. It doesn't matter. No one knows, right? They can look at the list and figure it out, but it doesn't feel like, oh, blue-white is over-supported and every other color pair is nerfed because they have less fixing lands. But the reality is that, Stirring Wildwood is not going to really do anything in my environment on power level, but Colonnade is powerful enough to make the cut there.
Yeah. And speaking of color pairs, that'll move us on to misconception number 3. So that's every color pair, when you build a cube, you can only really do one strategy with it. Red and blue, you've got to do Spell Slinger. Red and black, you've got to do Sacrifice. White and blue's got to be Control, sort of, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is largely inherited from what we see a lot in contemporary modern limited design, where when Wizards of the Coast designs a set to be drafted, I think for a lot of reasons, they often kind of seed a little bit of a more explicit strategy in each color pair. And I think one of the reasons is to give like a kind of foothold or like a place to start for less enfranchised newer players that maybe don't know, absent those explicit, on the card keywords or strategies, what cards go together or how to draft a deck that's cohesive. It also just gives a different texture to the draft, right? Like drafting a red-black sacrifice deck feels a lot different than drafting a red-black mid-range deck. So there are reasons why you want to have that, but there's absolutely nothing to say you can't have multiple overlapping different kinds of strategies for each color pair. And at least in my own cube design, I specifically don't think about that at all, really. Like if you ask me what is the strategy of these 2 colors, I'd be like, I don't know, figure it out, I guess. I mean, I know from having played my cube a lot that, like a green-black control deck is not really going to work, right? There's not really the cards there to support that. But I would not be surprised if someone did put together someday some deck that's like a bunch of green-black planeswalkers and black board wipes, and like it plays kind of controlling E because it has ways to answer all these creatures and do these asymmetrical board wipe things. So yeah, it's this again gets to like the depth, I think, of cube design, where a lot of people start with that more explicit stuff because it makes the most sense from a like first entry point to like what designing an environment can be. But then in reality, it can be anything, right? It doesn't have to adhere to these very specific archetypal or like thematic ideas in each color pair.
I think this could also relate a lot to the first topic of just playing the most powerful cards, where if you are saying, I want to play the most powerful cards in the history of Magic, the most powerful green cards are probably going to be a bunch of elves and a crater hoof. There's not like a ton of flexibility, but as soon as you get past that first hurdle of, okay, we don't need to be just playing the most powerful cards, there's a lot of design flexibility, it's really easy to see, oh, there's all kinds of different things that any color pair or any individual color could be doing.
Yeah. Because I know as well, it's something you see, I guess, is retail limited the term, I guess? As you guys were
That's
mentioning.
what we tend to say in the cube world. I mean, everyone else just calls it limited, but when you talk about cube draft so much, it's helpful to like distinguish.
Have a separate sort of term.
Yeah, distinguish like booster draft from like actual sealed boosters or retail limit, whatever you want to call it, from curated cube environments.
Because I know that in retail limited they will often very explicitly have, usually an uncommon, they'll call it like a signpost card and be like, this is a card which is, this is what this color pair does. And obviously when you're building a cube, like do you think, do those cards have a place, or is that something you can sort of do without? Or
yeah, I mean, that's again, a lot of our answers might be frustrating in terms of you can do whatever you want, right? But like some people do really like having those signpost cards in their cube as well, and whether that means that, like I've seen cubes, for example, that have multiple signpost cards for the multiple different strategies that blue-white can be. It's like there's a blue-white Flyers deck, so there's a blue-white Flying Lord, and there's also a blue-white Control deck, so there's Supreme Verdict, whatever you want to like do. I've seen that happen before as well. So it really comes down to like, is that the kind of message you want to send to your drafters? Like, do you want to send this explicit, like, here is what this thing is about? And there's a lot of reasons why you might want to do that, for the same reasons that Wizards of the Coast does that in retail limited, especially if you're playing with people that don't know cube as well, that are newer to Magic, that want those additional explicit, like, oh, I got this second pick blue-white Bird Lord, and so I took every card that said bird on it afterwards, and I ended up with a functional deck, and that was very satisfying for me to feel like I knew what I was doing and I knew what to look for in the packs.
Yeah. Again, possibly I may have phrased the question a bit longer. It's not you can do about that if you want to do about that, but if you want to build a thing, you want to build something more like retail limited, you absolutely can. Like there are no right or wrong answers, I guess, as long as it all kind of comes together.
Yeah, I would say there's no right or wrong answers because it's a creative project. What you want to accomplish is kind of up to you. Where there are right and wrong answers is when you say, this is what I want to accomplish. How do we do that? Where are we actually successful in creating this kind of environment that you're looking for?
So is that, I suppose, when you start out, should you have maybe a goal in mind, or sort of more organically build towards something as you get your cards together? Or
I mean, like any creative process, it is going to be different for different people. I would say for most people, just start with what's exciting. If there are cards that you want to play, pick those first. But at some point, when you start wanting to be answering questions like, is this successful? Then it does become necessary to sort of establish those goals. And the goals can be really abstract. It can be, well, I have a rotating cast of people at the local play group that, are different skill levels, and I want them to be able to compete in this way. Like that can be a goal. Or I really like to play black-white life gain. I would like that to be an effective deck. That can also be a goal. So it can take lots of different forms.
Yeah, you can just approach it sort of, as you'd wish to. Which links us in to number 4, I suppose. So a cube, again, the misconception would be it's no place for your pet cards. You've got to have, sort of specific optimal cards. So,
cube is
no place.
Cube is the only place
for your pet cards.
Yeah, exactly.
We should call it Pet Cards the format. That would do a lot to get people to understand more of what it was. Yeah, I mean, I think the joy of cubes being able to play whatever cards you want. I mean, you can do that a little bit. Like, I think that's a big part of why EDH is successful, right? Like, Commander, through its multiplayer nature, through the nature of being singleton, through the fact that it's got this Commander, which is this reliable thing you have access to. I think really, like, when that format became popular, it unlocked just this whole history of Magic cards that, like, were not viable in Modern or Legacy or Standard or Vintage or whatever, that now it's like, oh, if my commander is this card is now incredible because I'll always have access to my commander, and now I can get this weird old uncommon from Prophecy or whatever, and it becomes this incredible, powerful card. And the fact that the design of that format basically unlocked the viability of all these cards that people like, right? Like, everyone's I feel like every card, for the most part, is someone's favorite card, right? Or maybe not exactly that, but if you like were to map the affection or the desire to play with cards and compare that to like the competitive viability of cards in constructed formats, we're talking about the like cream of the crop, the like upper crust of cards that are actually viable in competitive formats, and then a huge long tail of cards people just love that they don't have a place to play. And Cube is the absolute perfect place to play that. It's like EDH, except not multiplayer, obviously. So I think if you don't like,
although it can be,
of course, that's right.
Yeah.
But if you want to play with cards in a specific context, Cube is the only format that gives you total control over that context, unless you want to design 4 EDH decks and give them to your friends. And like these 4 decks are always playing together, right? But the nature of a format like Commander is you're playing with other people's cards, right? And they might not have the exact same perspective on the game as you, the exact same power level calibration or whatever, and so your pet cards still could just flounder and not work at all because your opponent just, I don't know, Thassa Oracle and what's the Demonic Consultation? They Consultation Oracle you, right, on like turn 3 or whatever. It doesn't matter what your deck was doing. Cube is the only place where you get to control that context completely and decide what are the powerful cards, what are the powerful strategies, what do you want to be successful, and really focusing on making the things that you like about the game or the things you want to capture with your cube the successful things. That is the exercise of cube design, right? Like, identify what you like and then make what you like successful in your environment so that the experience of playing it is naturally going to emerge in playing the things that you enjoy about the game.
Yeah, when you're designing a game, and designing a cube really is like designing a game to some degree, you always want to make the fun thing the thing that is optimal. So when players inevitably will try and win, they will do the fun thing, not do this other thing and have it degenerate. And so while you could say, well, I can build my modern deck around this pet card and go to a competition, players just aren't going to do that because it's not going to be effective. It's not going to be an optimal way to try and win. But in cube, you absolutely can try and just align those.
Yeah. I think you mentioned this in one of your more recent podcasts. I think you said sort of with a cube, you can sort of take your pet cards and you sort of start with those and then like can build out the cube just from around those. So yeah, as you mentioned, it can be pet cards, the format. You can, rather than a place where a cube is no place for your pet cards, it is the place for them. Can you guys give any examples then, let's say, some personal pet cards you've got and how you might have built an environment where those sort of fit in, as it were, or where you could make best use of them?
I think you should start with this one, Anthony.
I mean, my cube is a whole bunch of pet cards. One of my favorites is White Mane Lion, which I think for me was just a big level up moment. And here's this card. It seems kind of bad. It has this huge downside, but then obviously you can turn that downside into an upside. So doing those kinds of fiddly things that Andy really doesn't like about Magic is really satisfying. And especially seeing another player say, whenever I drew this card, it was great. Like, it just felt great in my hands because I knew I had so much flexibility.
Having surprise in their voice too. Like,
right.
Like oftentimes it's like I didn't think White Mane Lion would be good in my deck, but I took it because it was in the cube and I was kind of forced to play it because it was playable and in my colors. And then I discovered this thing that you had baked into the environment from the beginning, which is that it actually is successful, it is good, it is fun, and people discover that because they might not have expected that from the draft.
Another one that I love is Knight of the Reliquary, which is the sort of like poster card on Cube Cobra for my cube. And I just love how in the context of a much lower power environment with a lot of lands that do different things, it just turns into this little toolbox where you can scry with it when you need to, or you can get a bounce land if you really need to basically essentially hit your next land drop the next turn. My whole list is just a bunch of pet cards.
What cards would you? Yeah. What about you, Andy, then?
Well, I think the best example of this for me is actually kind of a slightly different angle on it, which is I historically don't. I have a conflicted relationship with combat tricks because in one way I want to like combat tricks because they are flexible, they do a lot of things, and they also reward you for like playing in a specific way. Like if you navigate the board state into a specific context, they become extremely powerful, right? And so like cards that have that flexibility where it's like they have a wide range of what they're capable of doing and you are rewarded for your skillful play and like savvy sequencing to make them good is a lot of what I like about Magic. The downside of the combat tricks is that in a lot of places they're kind of just traps because if you are playing against a lot of instant speed removal or whatever, they can just, be 2-for-1 traps to kill yourself. And sometimes they're just dead in your hand, which you don't really like about them. And I also sometimes find that the times they're good are not actually times where you had to like savvily play around some like complex board state. It's just like, I have a combat trick and you can't afford to play around it. And so I will just play normally. And then at some point I'll get you with it. Right. And so because of my like weird conflicted relationship with combat tricks, I actually designed a whole cube explicitly around combat tricks. I was like, here's a cube where I want to like take a bunch of combat tricks and make them good in the way that I want them to be good, right? Good in the way that I enjoy them. I want to focus on all the aspects I like about combat tricks and try and minimize all the things I don't like about them. And that was kind of the seed crystal for that entire environment. So like with that cube, I just started with, all right, here's a big pile of combat tricks that I enjoy. And then I kind of like took one layer out from there and said, all right, what are cards that play well with combat tricks? And it's like, well, obviously we have all the heroic cards. We have cards that trigger when you cast instants and sorceries, because instants and sorceries are largely, because combat tricks are largely instants and sorceries. We have cards that care about spellcasting. We have cards that care about power and toughness. We have all these kinds of cards that become our obvious inclusions. And then you kind of take that same approach and go a little bit wider out, and that's how that entire cube was built, right? And I explicitly limited instant speed interaction, or made instant speed interaction that was going to remove creatures' toughness base, so that other combat tricks could also answer that interaction, and you could have this kind of like thing that was reminiscent of like a counter war, but it was like a combat trick war over your creature. We're like, I'm going to try to disfigure it. It's like, I'm going to giant growth it. It's like, well, now I'm going to also rate it. It's like, I'll do another combat trick to it. And I think that cube specifically is a very obvious way to showcase how you can build an environment around a specific thing you enjoy or specific set of pet cards, and that could be what the entire cube is about. And it ended up working out pretty well. I'm very happy with that environment.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a really good example, I suppose. Yeah, you like the sort of gameplay which combat tricks provides. You make a whole environment where, like, you will have, the combat trick cube, and it'll be, What was I going to say as well? I did actually, I think it was an interaction which didn't end up working. I think, is it Blood First or Blood Rush? One of the Gruul mechanics. I always get those two mixed up. The one where sort of turns the creatures into combat tricks. I think I had a while, I was sort of brainstorming, I thought, I'll combine that with Heroic, and that'll be really fun. And then they don't trigger Heroic, do they, those? Or
is Heroic spell or ability? It's just spell, isn't it? Because otherwise you can just trigger it with like an onboard ability. Yeah, it wouldn't work, I guess, because it's an ability, not a spell. I definitely found that like the Blood Rush cards did not work in that cube because of what you just said, right? All the things that the combat trick cube was built around were built around largely the understanding that it was going to be instants and sorceries that were going to be, mostly instants, let's be real, that were the combat tricks. And so something like Blood Rush, which is an ability, which, kind of like breaks Heroic, it breaks Young Pyromancer, it like, breaks all those things that care about that particular effect, which of course you could build an entire cube around Blood Rush and similar abilities, right? Like you could just go the other direction and say, let's get Young Pyromancer and Silver for a Partisan out of here, and let's put in, cards that care about activating abilities or whatever, and you could have a similar environment that's built around whatever kind of core thing that you're trying to make shine.
Yeah.
I would
go.
I put one caveat on this sort of pet card discussion, in that cube is definitely the place for pet cards, but maybe the same cube isn't the space for all the same pet cards at once. So if you're saying, my pet cards, I love Black Lotus and I love Giant Growth, you can put them in the same cube, but if someone has the choice of playing one of them, like Giant Growth just isn't going to get played in a lot of contexts because the power level's not there. But that's an easy fix. Just build two cubes.
Yeah. And a good example of that is like, my main cube is very powerful. It does play many of the most powerful cards in Magic. A lot of the sort of, cast of just Modern and Legacy, constructed viable cards. And I like in that environment having tons of interaction. Actually, I really love interactive Magic, and so I want as much instant speed removal and stuff as I could possibly get my hands on. And so in that environment, even though I like certain aspects of combat tricks, that environment kind of naturally highlights the things I don't like about combat tricks, and I think they would be largely a trap in my main cube. And so it is sometimes, I don't want to say incompatible, because that's just a really strong statement, but it's sometimes very, very difficult to make two things or three things all play together in the exact same environment. That can be sometimes an almost unsolvable problem. And that's why, multiple cubes, like Anthony said. Just I have my main cube where it's just full of nothing but one-man interaction, and I have my combat trick cube where that is at a premium and very specifically, structured to be, just to be different, right? Like that cube also runs a lot more sorcery speed removal, because sorcery speed removal still performs the function that interaction provides, but it doesn't have the blowout effect versus combat tricks.
Yeah, so it wouldn't just be able to sort of stop, these sort of combat trick wars in their tracks kind of thing.
Right.
One other thing as well that's interesting, so you build around themes that you enjoy, but I think it was your combat trick cube. There was a sort of Death Shadow deck, am I right, which sort of emerged, which you hadn't...
Yeah, there were a couple of things that just kind
seeded?
of came, because, I mentioned kind of the first couple layers of like what was the combat trick cube. You start with combat tricks, then you go to the obvious stuff that plays with combat tricks, and that isn't really enough to fill a cube still, right? Like if you like, kind of look at that set of cards, maybe you have a lot of like red and blue stuff, or, you've got most of your like one section filled out. Maybe red, blue, and white has a lot of things, but you sort of have to keep going if you want to actually fill out a whole cube. And so a couple of things ended up making total sense in that environment, that if I had sat down in advance of designing that cube and said, let me plan out all of my strategies and all of my decks in my cube, and then I'll go find the cards for them, I never would have picked these things. But it turned out that like modular and +1/+1 counters made a lot of sense in this environment, right? Because there's a lot of combat tricks that do put +1/+1 counters on things. All the stuff that cares about power matters can also care about +1/+1 counters and not just combat tricks. And then that was one other kind of deck that worked out there. And then similarly, this like Death Shadow deck ended up kind of coming out of nowhere, where it was like, all right, well, I've got like painful mana base, right? I've got like shock lands in this cube and like fetch lands, so you end up like losing a lot of life to casting these things. There's a lot of the removal. I even mentioned, Ulcerate before, which is a removal spell that costs you 3 life to cast, which is a perfect kind of removal spell for that environment because it cares about toughness and, can be answered with combat tricks and like Dismember, those kinds of cards. And so it ended up being that just when I had done this like natural exploration of just adding a bunch of cards that like all connected to the previous layer of cards, I ended up with a shell that worked pretty well just to throw Death Shadow and Scourge of the Skyclaves in. And now it's just like a Death Shadow deck there, which still cares about power. Like power matters for Death Shadow, and Scourge of the Skyclaves makes sense. These are cheap creatures that can have a lot of power. And it would not have been where I would have expected to end up with the combat trick cube, but it ended up making perfect sense in reality.
Oh, sort of flowing from, so you sort of take your first layer of themes, you sort of build out from there, and eventually, you reach some things you may not have expected sort of setting out.
Yeah, to me, that's like the most fun way and the most rewarding way to design a cube, because it is like very much a design exercise. You are making decisions at every layer, but there's also this big aspect of discovery and emergence where it's like, I don't really know what's going to like come out of this, and I'm excited to like see what makes sense, play with it, see how viable the cards are. And that process of discovery, I think, is really satisfying. It like helps you unlock like, oh, I didn't even know I wanted to play with Death Shadow, right? Like it wasn't even on my map as a card that I thought I would enjoy. But it turns out when you have combat tricks that give things double strike, Death Shadow is really fun. It's just a really fun card to play with. It's really like swingy board states, and just can really make things work out. The other thing that made sense there too, honestly, is that there's not a ton of burn spells in that environment for similar reasons, right? Because they can have this blowout effect versus combat tricks. A lot of them are instant speed, and I think Death Shadow in an environment with a lot of burn spells can become a liability, because it's like, all right, well, I want to go to a low life total to play my Death Shadow, my Scourge of the Skyclaves, have them be big, but then I don't just want to die to some random, lightning bolt to the face or whatever. And so that was another thing I didn't realize I had chosen explicitly, but ended up being a thing that supported that kind of deck, where it's like, yeah, you can afford to go down to 2 or 3 life with your Death Shadow and Scourge of the Skyclaves, because you're not just going to die to whatever burn spell off the top most of the time.
Yeah. One more thing then before we move on to the next misconception. I don't know if this is sort of a test, but there's one particular card which is a pet card of mine. Don't know why. Maybe this reveals I'm a massive sort of Timmy, I guess. I really like the card Impervious Great Worm. Do you guys know it was the buy a box promo rather from Guild of Ravnica? Big
1818 or some obscene
size.
size. Is indestructible.
1616 indestructible and convoke, I think.
Looking up on my phone, so I don't have to mess up the screen recording here.
So let's assume I really wanted to build a cube where Impervious Great Worm would shine. What sort of stuff? I mean, obviously, I suppose token generation for convoking it out and things, maybe some flings, but what sort of stuff would I want to put in with Impervious Great Worm?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually something I've been wanting to do, I think, at some point, is like maybe stream some, live cube design where we talk about like, get like, 6 or 7 pet cards from the viewers and like see if we can combine them into something that makes sense. So like you said, I think tokens makes a lot of sense. So you're going to want tokens to have that convoke cost be playable and get this card out. I also think you're going to want to look at a cube just generally where you can afford to play 10 mana spells. Even though it's going to be hopefully cheaper when you actually play it, it's still going to be a really expensive card to cast. And so if the cube is, a bunch of low curving decks and aggro decks, it's going to be maybe hard to get to that 10 mana spell and make it playable. So that is kind of a very big picture effect on the environment. Also, with Indestructible, I think you want to be careful about exile removal, because if your whole deck is built around putting this giant worm into play and then your opponent's just like, haha, path to exile, sucks to be you, that is probably not going to be rewarding the kinds of things you want to reward. So just thinking about like, even just this one card, which is a relatively simple card, right? It's just got power, toughness, and 2 keywords on it, right? Like it's not an overly complicated card. There's not a ton of things to key off of here, but it still says a lot about the kind of cube where it could possibly have a home by looking at just those effects. And then thinking about ways, how do I want people to be able to interact with the Impervious Great Worm, right? Like, if I don't want to include Path to Exile, do I want to include 5 mana exile spells? So it's at least still a big investment of my opponent if they want to get rid of this thing. Do I just want to say, sorry, if I get Impervious Great Worm in play, then you just can't deal with it. Like, tough, you're probably going to lose. The other thing I think about here is that some of these things kind of conflict with each other. So you mentioned token generation to pay for the convoke cost, right? But this is a 16/16 with no trample and no evasion. So if you have a bunch of tokens running around, maybe it just becomes the world's most expensive, the Abyss, or the Abyss. That's the one that makes people sacrifice a creature every turn, because your opponent can just chump block it for eternity. And so then you're like, all right, well, if they can chump block it for eternity, do I want to get rid of the token stuff? Do I want to add equipment and like ways to grant trample and things to like a cube like this? I think a lot of times too, it becomes like, all right, I like this card. What are cards that are similar enough to it that I can actually have a density of them to make this kind of effect something I can build my cube around, right? Because you have exactly one Impervious Great Worm. You can't really design a whole cube just assuming that the players that are playing green or whatever are going to have access to Impervious Great Worm. Yeah. So what are other big creatures that share the traits that you like about Impervious Great Worm, and what do they actually have in common? Is it the Convoke they have in common? Is it the indestructibility they have in common? Is it the just big piles of power and toughness on giant creatures they have in common? And there's ways to make all of those individual things play more in an environment. And so, yeah, that's kind of, I think, how I go about it. Do you have a different answer to that, or?
No, I think you hit a lot there.
So just sort of, I guess, figure out what you like about the card, and then sort of pick other kind of similar cards. You can sort of start building an environment out. Yeah, no, I think it is just such a strange card to me because it's just this pointlessly, massively big creature with no form of evasion whatsoever. And I just think, like the exercise of let's find a format where that will, be a sort of A-star pick is just an interesting one to me.
I think it may, in fact, indicate you're a bit of a Timmy, which is, of course.
I think I definitely am, yeah. We'll move on then to the next one. So misconception number 5. You must never include sort of parasitic themes in your cube. So that means no tribal, no mill, and nothing like storm.
Do you want to take us, Anthony? I talked a lot about the Impervious Great Worm.
So obviously the answer is no, of course. You can include whatever you want in your cube. There is a negative to some of these effects that is worth describing, but then that negative isn't absolute. But the problem is just you can create these sort of on-rails draft experiences where if I'm taking these storm cards, I only take the storm cards, and now I'm not really having this diverse, complex experience during the draft. But again, going back to goals, is your goal that every single player always has the most high decision, high complexity draft experience every single time? Honestly, probably not. So
we've definitely played some cubes that I think go too far in the like flat power level, high decision agency, where it's like you look at a pack and you're like, all right, all these cards are exactly Bs or exactly C pluses, and therefore I have no idea what to take. It just feels like I'm just choosing whatever I like or like want to play, and not making a strategic evaluation of what is the best card in this pack, because it's just all right, all these cards are the same. Like great job. That's actually not fun either, right? So so there's a lot of things that push and pull on a cube environment that I think you actually want a little bit. Like I think you want committal picks. You want cards that are only good in some context and not every context, and that is kind of the beginnings of what you're describing here with this parasitism, where it's like, all right, here's cards that only work in very specific narrow contexts. I think if you don't have that, if everything's just lightning bolts that just play in every single deck that play that color, that becomes a very flat and unengaging draft environment very, very quickly. And so it's really just a matter of dialing in how much you want for the kinds of games you're trying to make.
Those kinds of parasitic archetypes, also that matters a lot more, I think, in the actual draft experience. So I think if you're just a person that enjoys some of those mechanics, some of that kind of gameplay, right, and you aren't as interested in the draft, maybe you just do a draft and then keep the decks together and just play them again and again, then it's just not really going to be a factor. For my own main cube, I also just like to look for sort of a diversity of different sort of scales of themes and how complex they are. So I have a little bit of a light zombie theme, and I think it actually
light zombie theme.
It plays out very well that some oftentimes newer players, if they're like this is their first time drafting a cube, they might gravitate to that because it sort of broadcasts itself. Here, this card says get more zombies, and they can do that. And it is a deck that can reasonably compete, so it's not just like, oh, you're doing the level 1 strategy that will never succeed. But then from that, a more experienced player might say, okay, well, this zombie theme overlaps a little bit with these other themes, so there's actually depth to it as well. So
that's
an
important layer there, too, the fact that I think as a cube designer, if you are going to include a high density of these narrower themes, one of the big challenges is making sure that they actually are competitive with each other, because if you include mostly just kind of flexible cards that can go in lots of decks, then it's more up to your players to decide how they go together, and if your deck ends up not being good, it's more attributable to player error than it is to necessarily cube design, oversights. But if you're like, I include all these zombie cards, and someone says, great, there's clearly a zombie theme here, and takes all the zombie cards, and then they just get stomped in all 3 matches because those cards, when put together, are not actually powerful enough to hang with what the rest of the environment is doing, I think that's more on you as the cube designer. It's like, yeah, you pretty much broadcasted that in the packs, that was a thing, and it ended up not being a thing. And so that, I think, is worth some revisions in the cube design process.
So just sort of, in that example, maybe cut some... So would you fix that? I guess you could integrate more zombie support, or would you sort of swap the zombies out for cards which weren't all the same tribe? Or...
There's all kinds of ways you could do it. You could try and make zombies better. You could try and make the whole rest of the cube worse, so it was the exact same zombie package that you like, just is now competitive because you made every other deck, not as effective anymore. You could make it more flexible. You could do anything, right? Like, and that's the reason that we've been really into cube now for 4 or 5 years, and it's like the only kind of Magic I really think about or play that much, and it's just an endless well, because when you come to a question like that, you're like, I could do whatever I want. Like the world is my oyster, right? Like if you're like tuning an EDH deck and a package doesn't work, it's like, all right, well, I guess I have to throw this package out, or if I can't make it any better, or make it better, right? Then you're just done. That's it. Here it's like, if you like this package and it consistently O3s in your cube, you can just change your whole cube to make that package actually the good thing. Maybe the rest of the cube got a little bit away from you, and you want to just take the top 3 most powerful cards out of every other strategy and do that repeatedly until you make this package actually successful the way you want it to be. And that's the just ongoing churn of cube design.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit off topic, but the context also really, really matters. So in that particular case, thinking about the speed of the format, the type of interaction that's available is really going to dictate how successful that kind of deck is. And, currently not much of the interaction actually removes things permanently from the graveyard. There's a lot of tokens, so slower strategies can be pretty effective. So this kind of grindy graveyard recursion zombie theme is actually pretty strong in this cube right now, but it's because of all that context that it is.
Don't just sort of put the zombies in by themselves. Look at what the zombie cards are doing, often lots of graveyard stuff, and then sort of build that more into it, I guess. Another interesting thing, I guess, when we mention parasitic mechanics, like, it's also not great to think of these as just an absolute no-no, because lots of them, like, Tribal, Mill, Storm, those are all some pretty fun archetypes. So those are all things, people like those.
Tribal is extremely resonant, like, from the beginning of Magic. People, even before Tribal actually mattered mechanically, people would just put all the goblin cards together because they want to have the feeling of playing the goblin deck. Yeah,
they belong together. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is, like, and like Anthony said, I think some players just prioritize the draft a lot less. It's less important to them that the draft be like incredibly nuanced and interesting. And it's like, if what you enjoy is playing these matchups with these more narrow decks, then you can build an environment where the draft is a little more on rails. And like by the end of pack 1, you got to kind of pick a lane and just stick to it. You still have choices in every pack, right? The draft is not a foregone conclusion. It is not completely irrelevant anymore. It's not totally boring. It's a little different than a draft where you're kind of constantly trying to stay open and change and like adapt. But then the end is you get this. This is the other thing I really love about Cube, right? Is that in Constructed, I really liked for a while back in the day this blue-black fairies deck in Modern, which I thought was really fun with Bitter Blossom and Spellstutter Sprite, and just thought it was a really cool, fun deck. I liked the way that it played. And eventually some more cards got printed that got added into the deck, and the deck, Modern moved along, and the deck kind of got dropped off behind, and it fell out of the meta. But the reality is that, like, that's just the one deck, right? Like, that's one blue-black fairies deck. Maybe I make a tweak here or there, but, like, it's kind of been tuned, it's been optimized, like, it's just that. And the reality of Cube is, even if you do like these very narrow things, I think there's an argument for playing Cube over just building some kitchen table decks and playing them against each other, because every time you sit down, the variance and the player agency in the draft means you get a different variation of this deck, right? Like, you get a different blue-black fairies deck, or a different Storm deck, or a different Mill deck that has differences to it, which just adds to the depth and the interest in playing it, because you get to, like, decide for yourself, like, what are the most important pieces for this deck, and maybe you and another player just slightly disagree on what the most important pieces are. Now, we actually have a podcast episode coming out tomorrow, which is Anthony and I both drafting the same seed of my cube, and I think if you took all Magic players across the broad spectrum of Magic players and put them all, in some big map of like how similar or dissimilar they were, I think Anthony and I are very similar in terms of our skill, how we engage with the game, like, what we value in a draft.
We'll let the listeners decide that.
I do, though, and in this particular draft, like, we kind of went totally different directions, and we talk about how that happened and why. And so, that's the beauty, I think, of having a cube, is that, or one of the many things that are beautiful about having a cube, is that you get this nuanced, novel experience every time you sit down to play it, even if you do like these more committal, narrow archetypes, you're going to get a different version of that every single time, which is, I think, really satisfying and fun.
I mean, you're hinting at another sort of theoretical risk of if you took the most extreme hyperbolic example and said, green is only elves and it's cards that care about elves, red is only cards that say goblin and care about goblins, then you would just have less diversity because either you're drafting the elves or you're drafting the goblins. Whereas if you have cards that have some degree of overlap and can be used in different ways, you'll see more just diversity and interesting combinations, which that can be, again, one of your goals. That can be one of the things that really appeals to you. But it's hard to get to that extreme where it actually starts to become noticeable and problematic. And in the context of Cube, you're designing a cube and most likely you're changing it. So if you do 2 drafts in a row and it was like, oh, we kind of saw the same decks again, you can just change some cards and it's not going to be a problem the first draft. And when it does become a problem, you can fix it then.
And also, unless your red section is literally just goblin creatures, right? You're going to have some burn spells. You're going to have some combat tricks. You have some other stuff to kind of support that. Then some players just going to take some elves and some burn spells. It's like, is that a deck? I don't know. And that's
Elf burn.
Let's find out.
And it's called Elf Ball, but it doesn't usually have red in it. But that's kind of the fun to me of Cube, where it's like it's. I've actually kind of had the idea for a while. I haven't done it because I think it would be not that fun to do, but I kind of want it to be done so I can talk about it, which is just trying to make the most on rails draft experience you could in a singleton cube, right? Like, you're not allowed to put duplicate cards in. Just like try and make a cube where most players would agree that the pick in each draft pack is like a foregone conclusion. You have to take this because that's the only thing that's reasonable to take. And how close can you actually get to a broad selection of players agreeing like, yeah, we have to take that. It's obvious. And I don't think you could get that close, honestly. I think even if you tried to make a draft environment that, minimize that as much as possible, the draft was as on rails as possible, I think it would be a huge challenge because the reality of just shuffling up cards and distributing 15 cards at random and all the different ways that players value different effects and cards in the game means that there's just so much depth to even a single pack that people are just going to disagree about it.
Yeah. Like, so even if it was, I don't know, 5 mono color, only elves, only goblins, only zombies or something, the ways people would build those would be different every time, and you could merge and mix them, I guess, in different. Well, maybe not merge and mix. I guess you wouldn't. If it was tribal, you wouldn't necessarily be doing that. But yeah, no, I take your point.
Because there's the thing, you might design a cube that you think is like a hero of my tribes, and you really want it to be one or the other, and then it turns out that actually some other player figures out that if you ignore all those tribal synergies and just take the best elves and the best goblins and the best zombies, you can make a really sick Jund deck where the card quality is just better than all of these other like archetypes. Like that can absolutely happen. I would be remiss here not to mention that I also did design a tribal cube explicitly to push back against the idea that tribal was a parasitic narrow thing. I tried to make a cube where tribal was the theme and it was inherently non-parasitic with a lot of changelings and stuff like that. Ultimately, I think the end result there is kind of not even really tribal anymore in the sense that the way the tribal cards play, like the lords basically play as these build-arounds for like either cards that actually have that type on them or changelings, which have all types on them, obviously. So it ends up being just a very weird, like high synergy environment where you do end up drafting a tribal deck, but it doesn't feel tribal because there's so many different ways the tribal thing can go. So like again, you could take any like assumption people have about Magic, like combat tricks are bad in Cube or tribal decks are all parasitic, and definitely design a cube that just blows that right out of the water.
Just sort of flips it. Yeah. So I think you may have actually answered the next question I was going to ask in that. But I was going to say, when people think of sort of, I guess, tribal blocks, as it were, I think Lorwyn is generally quite fondly remembered, and Ixalan probably a bit less so. Would you say that is then because in Lorwyn, say, there are things like changelings you mentioned, sort of ways of crossing the streams a bit more, which make it more entertaining, or?
I think actually at the time Lorwyn was not super well received. I think that there's just a lot of bias, in the way we look back at it. But I mean, for me personally, Lorwyn just has fantastic flavor and aesthetics, and that's really what draws me to it. And I think what draws a lot of people to it as well. Whereas Ixalan felt a little bit flat. I think you were describing, why do you make a set about colonialism? Actually. That's not really a great look.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we weren't playing during original Lorwyn, so I mean, we're probably not the best people to ask about the perceptions of it compared to Ixalan. But yeah, I don't know. I do think there's a lot of, just in general with Magic players, there's a lot of retconning with how things were in the past, when in actuality, if you go back and look at the actual response and numbers, which you can listen to Mark Rosewater's podcast, Drive to Work, where he talks about this a lot, right? They do a lot of surveying and stuff like that. And so people might like say, I love Lorwyn. Lorwyn's great. And in actuality, the results from the survey might have been that no one liked Lorwyn Limited. People just liked the flavor, right? They just liked fairies and, goblins or whatever it was, or, the Lorwyn was the first one to introduce hybrid cards, right? That was the first block to do that.
Oh, it was
The first block
Ravnica.
was- Oh, right, it was.
Oh, Ravnica. Sorry, you're right. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. Great question.
It could just be then, maybe that's people remember Lorwyn more fondly because this Lorwyn has this sort of fairy tale theme, and the fairy tale theme has possibly endured, whereas the colonialism thing has less lasting appeal, shall we say.
Yes, probably.
Also, so I suppose the question I was trying to get at there is how, I guess, can you make sure in a tribal environment in a cube, how can you make sure that, it doesn't end up where it's just on rails? But, as I said, I think you answered that before I asked the question. So just, try and... Oh, sorry, I'm getting my words.
I mean,
I would challenge people to make it incredibly on rails and see what that feels like. You know, just so you know, if people, I think a lot of times cube designers are afraid of like these abstract ideas they think are going to be problems with their environment that they've kind of either made up or really exaggerated in their minds, where it's like, oh, the worst thing possible is like an on rails draft environment because they heard one person complain in one Ixalan draft that it was really boring to be stuck in their tribe or whatever. And I don't know, I feel like one of my favorite design principles when it comes to cube design and all kinds of design actually is just to like really push things to their extremes, right? Like if you are designing an environment and you like take your best shot at what you think the environment's going to be and you discover it's deficient in some ways, right? Oh, my players wanted more removal, or I felt like there was too many forward drops, or too many board stalls, right? You find something you want to address about the environment, something you want to change. People will often just like make a tiny little change, like, all right, let's just like add a few more removal spells or like a few more board wipes to stop stop board stalls or whatever, and then like test it again. And the reality is that, especially when it comes to something like cube design, where there's so much variance and so much luck and so much just like random and chance in play, that you really can't derive that much from a single playtesting session. And so when you make these small adjustments and expect to see them and like feel them in the actual play experience, oftentimes you just don't, or the amount of change you've made to the environment is overwhelmed by the noise in that variance. I always advocate for, like, if there's a problem with your environment, like, swing way the other direction. Like, add what you think is too many of the thing that you have not enough of, right? Just go crazy, because if you have those two extreme data points, it's much easier to calibrate where you want to be in between than if you're constantly making these tiny little adjustments and trying to, like, understand where they are and make those effects. So, like, yeah, I think if you are interested in a tribal environment and you're wondering what the like nature of on-rails drafting is going to be like and how parasitic it's going to feel, like, start by just swinging for the fences. Make it as on-rails as you possibly can. Don't shy away from any narrow, triple pip, high devotion, whatever card that is like in a specific like tribe. Just go for it and see what the experience is like. And then you will know from experience what changes you want to make, instead of kind of imagining what the problem might be, right? That happens all the time, I think, in cube design.
Yeah, so I suppose, it's much more about sort of practical, sort of seeing how it plays, rather than just in your head kind of worrying and then maybe overcorrecting if you think it might be too much of something.
Yeah, I mean, a thing about cube design is that, a lot of us, I think, spend a lot of time thinking about designing cubes because playing Magic is not a thing we can always do, right? Like, you have to have friends around, or if you like Arena or something, you can do that. But for the kind of Magic Anthony and I play, like, you got to have friends around, you got to, like, set aside a certain amount of time to play some Magic, and you just can't do it all the time, right? And so cube ends up filling this gap where it's like, my playgroup's not around this weekend, or the entire world is shut down for a 2-year global pandemic. Whatever the reason is that you can't get together and play, you end up cube designing instead, or like tweaking your cube or playing with it. And I think a lot of people sometimes get a little bit deep in that. And they're like, I'm like trying to make my cube perfect. I got to solve all these problems before I make people play it, and it ends up being a disaster. And it's like, look, Magic is fun. Drafting is fun. Like, draft is also pretty self-correcting, which is the other thing that I always encourage new cube designers about, is like, people are always worried about, what if this is too powerful? It's like, well, if it's powerful, everyone should agree it's powerful and fight over it, and then it'll be split in the draft, right? Like, draft is somewhat self-correcting. Magic is fun. Like, just do the thing and see how it turns out, and actually get that real world experience to learn how you want to like make those changes to your cube in the future, rather than spending all your time theory crafting and listening to our podcast.
Oh no, thanks. I think I've learned something there, I guess, in that it's you can get too sort of in your head, I guess, and you can sort of worry too much about you might be wrecking something, but maybe you're not. Give it a try, see how it turns out.
Yeah, and to be clear, like, it's fun to be in your head about cube. That's why we record the podcast and spend a bunch of time doing it. I just think it's good to like check yourself on
to be
assumed perceptions of like what things are likely to be like without having actually done it, to see what it actually plays like.
I'm just going to move on then to the next, I'm going to say, misconception here. So it's that cubes, they've got to be singleton, only one of each card.
They don't.
Nope.
I suppose that's sort of the answer to all
This
of
is
them.
a hard one to say much about because no one's making the rules. Just put whatever you want in. There's no police.
Yeah, and I think we see many more cube designers these days breaking singleton for at least fixing lands. That's kind of like the gateway drug to breaking singleton is I just don't want to, if I got a 540 card cube, but by the time I get to the 8th best fixing land in a given color, it's way less powerful than the first top 3 good fixing lands in that color for my own environment. And so breaking singleton on that, I think, is a very common thing in terms of breaking singleton. But we've seen cubes and design cubes ourselves that break singleton in very weird, novel ways where it's just like, I'm just going to have 3 of this one card. That's the only place I'm going to break singleton. I'm just going to put 3 of these in here because I want 3 of these to exist in Magic's history, and they don't, and so I'm just going to add 3 in. That's totally fine. The only thing I would say about this is, do whatever you want. I do think that singleton is a very helpful framework. The same way that you mentioned before, I have to have 5 of each guild card or whatever. That's a framework people use. I think is actually not that helpful. I think singleton is a very helpful framework in terms of just limiting the ways in which you could kind of screw up your environment. Maybe I think breaking singleton immediately opens up a much wider power range spectrum, a much wider amount of control for you as a designer that can be a little bit paralyzing if you are not very experienced with cube designer, don't know exactly what you're looking for, right? Because the question is all right, I'm breaking singleton in my cube. Do I take out every single burn spell for just more lightning bolts because lightning bolt is the best burn spell? Maybe that's what your cube wants. It might not be what it wants. And so I think singleton is a great way to just limit that and just say, yeah, you know what? If you need a starting place, start with singleton because it's actually a pretty helpful template. And then you'll know when you hit the point where you're like, I just wish there were more Faithless Lootings, and there aren't more Faithless Lootings, so what if I just put in 4, right? That's the thing you can do.
I mean, I would just say that singleton is a lot of fun. When I'm playing
That's true
Magic,
too,
I
yeah.
just want to play with more different cards. It's one of the big things where, in Constructed, you only actually end up having a pretty small number of cards in any given deck.
15 different cards in your modern deck because they're all play sets. Yeah.
So one of the things about Cube is forcing lots of unique cards and lots of unique combinations of cards. So I, as a baseline, want to be playing singleton. But yeah, a lot of Cube design gets in this weird space where it's we have to be singleton, but we do get to play 4 copies of Llanowar Elves just because 4 of them were printed.
Right.
And if you actually think that, I think my favorite example is actually Oblivion Ring and Banishing Light, where basically because there was a rules issue with one, they printed a new version that just worked a little bit more cleanly. And so Cube designers will say, oh, great, now I get to play 2 copies of these. But not
You could always do that,
You
friend.
always could have done that. But the
Play
reason
10
that you
copies.
have that opportunity now is just because of sort of this logistical, technical issue. So if you actually thought that 2 Oblivion Rings was better, you could have already just done that. So
That's
yeah,
one thing that does irk me in the cube design world. When people do say that, where it's okay, you are clearly designing a cube that is very oriented around a specific direction. You just want the most powerful cards, for example. So they print a new a new 1 mana dork, and you're like, hooray, a new 1 mana dork for me, right? We saw this with the printing of Ignoble Hierarch in Modern Horizons 2, one of the most popular cards for cubes broadly over the past year. That was Modern Horizons 2, right? Modern Horizons 1? Can't get things straight. But of course, you could just put in more. There's nothing stopping you from making your cube more powerful. If you are just basically waiting for Wizards to print more powerful cards so you can make your cube more powerful, you are giving up so much design autonomy to whatever Wizards of the Coast happens to decide to print instead of just designing the environment you want, right? You're holding yourself back in that regard.
But I would say if you are the kind of designer who's saying, I'm glad they printed a Banishing Light because now I can put both these cards in here because you want to keep strictly to singleton, that is totally fine. I think we just should appreciate that is an aesthetic decision, not a game design decision.
And to be fair, I was one of the cube designers really excited about Ignoble Hierarch too, not because it was another 1 mana dork, but because it was a different one. It is actually functionally different. The Exalted Trigger matters. The fact that it does encourage you to be a little more in a Jund color combo instead of just going in any green deck equally, are things that I actually really value about that card, because I don't run multiple Elvish Mystics or Llanowar Elves in my cube. I specifically limit myself to functionally singleton cards.
Yeah, I suppose, again, maybe misconception might be the wrong term, but singleton, I guess, it's a tool. If you want to build your cube, be singleton, that's great. You can use it if you want to. If you don't have to. With so many of these things, it's, build the cube you want to build.
I do think it's a good starting point because, like Anthony said, one of the biggest things is singleton is just fun. It's fun to know I have the only copy of this card. No one else can have it, right? It makes it more special when you draw it, more special when you open it in a pack. I think that's honestly a big part of the success of Commander 2, where
absolutely.
It's just more fun to have singleton decks, frankly. It appeals, I think, a little bit less to... that's not even true. I mean, Yeah, it's just fun to have Singleton decks.
And it's more fun when you're collecting, when you're building and upgrading the deck. When you say like, oh, I opened this booster pack and I got this sweet rare that I get to put into my commander deck or I get to add to my cube, that's really exciting. The experience of saying, oh, I opened up this sweet rare. If I want to build the modern deck, I have to go buy 3 more of them. It's like that's not an experience that is appealing for me personally. But yeah, or I want to buy this first fancy foil for my cube. The first one is so much more fun to acquire than the second.
What would Singleton Modern look like? You gotta ban Lucher immediately. But then after that, what does Singleton Modern look like?
One other thing as well, I guess slightly branching away from Singleton. So with cards, like I think I call them the collect me cards. I don't know if that's necessarily a term. Like Relentless Rats, Seven Dwarves. I think is it called Wretched from Crimson Vow, the zombie.
Persistent Petitioners.
Yeah, those kind of cards. What sort of space, I guess, would they have in Cube? Would you have to change the way they're drafted necessarily to make them viable, or could you just sort of cram some of them in? Or
you can just jam some in if you want. A lot of Cube designers will do like a draft package thing where they make a rule where if you draft one, you get multiple. I see this most often with Squadron Hawk. I think because the Caw Blade Modern deck was beloved before it got banned back in the day. But yeah, I mean, you could just do whatever you want. I mean, we're gonna save us all your questions, but I've seen both approaches. I've seen people that just put 11 Persistent Petitioners in their cube, and it's like draft as many as you can get. I've seen people that have draft packages where you draft one and you get some number. There's actually even cubes that play with multiples specifically, where like their entire cube is Kindles and Muscle Bursts and Diligent Farmhands and all these cards that care about how many copies you have, because in a Singleton environment, those cubes don't tend to do a lot. Accumulated Knowledge, those kinds of cards. So I've seen cubes specifically where it's like this cube is a multiples cube, and like there's 20 copies of Accumulated Knowledge and 20 copies of Kindle or whatever in the cube, and that's a very different kind of experience, but a very real one, right? It's like, all right, do I want this 2-mana draw 6, or do I want this 2-mana deal 7 to my opponent, right? Like you're playing in this space of like, there's still decisions to make of like, do I want my 6th Kindle or my 3rd Accumulated Knowledge? Like that's still a very important decision the draft player is making. It's very different than you're going to make in any other kind of drafted environment, but that's the joy of Cube.
Yeah, I mean, like anything, if you enjoy that, go for it. For me personally, I think a lot of those solutions with those multiple packages or, those kinds of multiples cards don't really appeal to me because for all those reasons that we just described, like Singleton is a lot of fun. And if you're saying I'm going to take 20 of these cards and make them, the functional duplicates or exact duplicates for that reason, it takes away some of that design space, and it is like the most extreme example of a linear or parasitic mechanic where once you have 3 Squadron Hawks, the 4th one is really, really important, and you're kind of taking away a lot of decision space. Again, like, try it.
But again, I would argue that you might not be if the option is 4th Squadron Hawk or 5th Kindle. Like, I don't know.
So it's like a really minor thing, but there's so many things to explore in cube design. That's not something I'm really specifically interested in. There is one exception. I designed a very stupid cube where I put every single alternate win condition almost in a cube and tried to actually see if we could make it into a game of Magic again. I'm not sure it quite got there, but what I ended up doing with the aligned, what is it called? Aligned Hedron network.
Yeah.
And there's a Simic card as well that does a similar thing where you need to have a bunch of them. I put in multiples, then also made it so if you drafted 1, you got 3. So you still have to draft them. Like getting 1 doesn't give you the complete package, but it doesn't take up too much space. And I think there's a balance that kind of works there, but it's a difficult area, I think, to really make work.
Sort of, yeah. Am I right in thinking then, is that the one you cracked Faithbound Judge and Crimson Vow, and then you sort of built the alternate WinCon cube kind of around that one, or?
So I actually asked Good Luck High Five what kind of cube they'd be interested in building, and one of them suggests the alternate win condition cube, and the rules tweak of you don't lose for having 0 life, so the only way you can win is actually with these alternate win conditions. And I fell into a rabbit hole, and
Put Necropotence in there just so you can draw your whole library without having to worry about losing your life total being gone.
Interesting.
Put Necro in.
And I suppose as well, because that condition then, sort of, if you don't care about life loss, that opens up whole new sort of things to explore as well. On top of these sort of alternate win stuff, yeah. That's another thing, I suppose, to talk about with Cube, like just sort of, you don't necessarily have to play Magic as Magic. You can sort of take and change any of the rules. Maybe you want players to have starting hands where they've got 5 cards rather than 7. Just, you can sort of chop and change anything.
It's really amazing as a game how resilient Magic is. It's really just this sort of shared rule set with a lot of different components designed within it. Another cube that I have is the Turbo Cube, where all spells and abilities cost 2 less to cast. And it's just amazing how we can just say, we're putting this emblem into play, it's changing the rules this way, but it is completely, what's the way to say it? It's understandable. You can figure out what the actual implications are.
There are no
have to-
rules. There are no lack of clarifications in the rules, right? Like,
Right.
it's very clear what actually happens. I think it's all the time whenever I play non-Magic games where I read the rules and I'm like, there's all kinds of edge
Right,
cases.
it's like, well, what
even
if-
in a very simple game, there's all kinds of edge cases you did not account for in the rules, and I have no idea what I'm actually supposed to do, and I'm just supposed to I guess or figure out what I think is the best approach. So the fact that Magic is so carefully thought out makes it the perfect kind of game to do this kind of like modifications to, because it's very rigid and clear how things are supposed to work, and you can make a change like that without it breaking the game. Well, breaking the game in a different way.
Breaking it, yeah.
It really breaks Guild Globe.
Next question. I'm actually looping back a bit. I think I asked question 7 before 6. So this is misconception 6. Your cube must have a flat power level. So ideally, you want your very best card and your very worst card to not be that far apart in terms of strength.
So
yeah,
I
why would that
mentioned
be
this a little bit, suggesting that you probably don't want Giant Growth and Black Lotus in the same cube.
Yeah.
But that is a little bit misleading. There's a lot more context that's relevant.
If it's a cube where like Giant Growth is really good in my combat trick cube. Put Black Lotus in there, be fine. What?
So
Gotcha.
it's a little bit misleading just to say these two cards don't fit in the same cube because they're of drastically different power level. Again, we need to think about context and what our goals are. In most cubes, players want all the cards to be relevant. You don't just want a card in there that you look at and say, oh, that's cute, but you're never actually putting into the deck because you're kind of losing some space. So that's the actual risk if you have extremely powerful and not very powerful cards, that you're just not really taking advantage of all of the design space that you potentially could have. But, I mean, if you throw just the one Black Lotus into a cube where everything else is of the same power level as Giant Growth, all those other cards are still going to be relevant as well. So, like, the whole curve and distribution is really what matters. So, yeah, I mean, going back to we were talking about pet cards, there are absolutely some cards in my main cube that are a little bit overpowered, but I just like them enough that it's like, I'm going to tolerate this disparity. And some games are going to be a little bit swung by this card, and players are maybe going to be a little bit frustrated when their opponents have it, but they'll also be excited when they have it. So you can absolutely increase that to a pretty high degree depending on what you're looking for.
And again, like we said, an actually flat power level is not good. You don't want that either.
Right, opening a pack and saying all of these cards are exactly the same power level, there's no direction, is actually not that fun either.
But that's also an example of an extreme that like is not really actually attainable. Like you can try and get as close as you want, and I think the closer you get, it does become less and less fun. There's just a balance you have to strike based on your own preferences.
As well as that, I think it can sometimes be quite hard to quantify like this idea of power level. Like there might be, let's say, a sacrifice card, which would be like an A+ in a sacrifice deck versus say a ramp card. Like, you know, how do you weigh these sort of things which are working on quite different sort of axes, I guess? So how do you compare
Big question. I don't know. That's tough.
So I guess maybe. Sorry, what am I getting at here? Like the idea of sort of power, like, you know, we don't necessarily have an intuitive ability to lock in what a card's power level might be, sort of relative to. I mean, obviously, you know, we'd know something like Black Lotus, you know, very good card. Bitter Blossom, that's a pretty powerful card. Like, you know, we can tell when it's sort of quite egregious that one card might be better than another. But if there's...
Yeah, I mean, but context matters as well. You can absolutely design an environment where removal is very efficient and there are powerful threats that are expensive, but just, you know, 2-for-1ing yourself by playing Black Lotus when your threat is going to get removed more than likely than not can actually make Black Lotus not that good.
It would not be that hard to make an environment where Black Lotus is not that good, I actually think. Like, because, I mean, for starters, Black Lotus is often not that good if it's not in your opening hand. I mean, if you draw it later in the game, it's a terrible top deck. It's just another land, basically, if you top deck it. So, like, wouldn't be that hard to make that card bad, actually.
Would it be possible to make a cube then where there are lots of cards which are conventionally thought of as being quite powerful, and you make an environment where they're all there, but they all kind of suck? Or would that not really...
I think that's
that would
actually
get harder?
Well, I would say that's really easy for a lot of certain types of cards that are classically powerful because context really matters. You know, if you say Arcbound Ravager is this extremely powerful card because it had this particular context, and you could put it in a constructed deck where it had all the support, and it can actually be very difficult to design a cube where that is very powerful. And
that's true. Like, if you just took the banned list from Legacy and Modern and like used that as a starting point for a cube, and then tried to make the rest of the cards you added make those cards bad, I think almost all those cards would be pretty unplayable, actually.
Obviously, things like fast mana and like the really efficient removal, that's always going to be pretty... It's harder to make those worse.
Efficient removal basically never gets banned. I mean, I guess balance, but that's a different kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing.
But like, there's no banning of Swords of Plowshares or whatever. Like, that's just, it's fine because it's just an answer.
I mean, yeah, if you'll tolerate extreme cases, again, going back to the Turbo Cube, you don't actually have a lot to do with colorless mana. So even in that context, Soul Ring is in there, but you have to really try hard to actually get some benefit from Soul Ring.
It occurs to me as well, so in the Turbo Cube, would Divination just be Ancestral Recall? Like, they'd functionally be...
Well, it only draws 2, but yes.
And no, pardon me. And that could moving swiftly on from that.
But what's the new card from the recent set that draws 3? And caps your hand size at 4.
Yeah,
that one's just Ancestral Recall, essentially.
Because you're never keeping cards in your hand in that cube anyway. Dump your whole hand on the battlefield.
Is that one of those? Is that a cleave card? Am I right?
It is a cleave card. Yeah, if you pay more
it,
for it doesn't cap your hand size afterwards. But yeah.
So moving on then, I think this is our final misconception. There are 2 more, but they're not really misconceptions. I'll get to that in a moment. I think this is something we've definitely touched on above. But yeah, some strategies have no place in Cube. Combat tricks, madness, life gain, and other similar strategies, they're too gimmicky to be in Cube. We've mentioned you have a whole sort of combat trick cube and things. Obviously, this is very much not the case.
Yeah. I mean, I think we covered this very thoroughly, but
yeah,
that's pretty much what our entire conversation was about. But yeah, like, not only can you make anything viable in Cube, but you can also make it play the way you want it to play. So even if you like don't like a particular card type for a specific reason, like you don't like Tribal because it's parasitic or narrow, I have a whole cube where Tribal is explicitly like the most open thing you can do. You just pack one, pick one, a changeling, and be thrilled about it because that opens up all these lanes of different tribes you can possibly play around. You can not only make anything viable, but you can make almost anything play differently and play in a way that you are satisfied with, if that's your goal.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you said, this is definitely something which we've discussed. So yeah, like if you like, let's say, gimmicky strategies, build your cube. So those will be sort of highlighted and stuff. So yeah, like this is definitely a misconception. We'll bring now onto our final sort of 2 points. So these, building a cube is expensive is the first of these. So is this a misconception? Is this something which is accurate? What are some sort of, I guess, tips for making cube building a bit less expensive?
So the thing that I tell people that are not familiar with Magic and they say, "Oh, Magic, isn't that kind of expensive?" What I tell them is, it doesn't have to be, but it is. You could just say,
answer possible.
"I'm gonna, treat this as I'm gonna go do a draft every Friday night, and it's like the same cost as going to a movie. And hey, I end up with some cards at the end, and just treat it that way. And it can be a thing that is not that expensive compared to other hobbies, but inevitably you're going to get sucked in, and you're going to sort of scale up. So." I mean, the real answer is of course no. You can absolutely build a budget cube for tens of dollars, and hell, you can just ignore sleeves and just put it in a Ziploc bag, and you can have a fun cube experience with that. But it's likely that most people are going to get much more invested in that.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that Cube is one of the places that is most friendly to proxies. Obviously, not cards that are designed to look like the real thing. Like, we're not talking about what's the word?
Counterfeits.
Counterfeit. We're not talking about counterfeits, right? But if you just want to play time walk in your cube because you think it's the right fit for your cube, but you don't have $5,000 sitting around to buy a time walk, you can just write time walk on an island, or make a very clear card that is not attempting to be a fraudulent copy of time walk, but just plays like the game piece, because this is not a sanctioned format. You're only playing within the context of your cube. You're not playing with other people's decks where you have to clarify before the game, like in EDH. Is it okay that I have a proxied time spiral or whatever in my deck? You just can put it in your cube and let people play with it. So that is the other thing, is that especially if you don't care about that aspect of it, cube design does not have to at all be hamstrung by budget. And then even if you are playing with only official WotC product, there's the fact that it is an entirely self-contained format means it is the most budget friendly, because EDH, yes, you can buy a precon. Is your precon going to be able to hang at the table with anybody that's been building their deck for a while? Probably not. Almost everybody ends up making your EDH deck more powerful, right? And so it's going to kind of stomp on a precon. And then it's all right, how much money are you willing to put into this to make it good? And there are definitely budget builds of EDH decks that are quite powerful, but the reality is that that's not what people are most driven by. And so, it's... I always tell people, how expensive is EDH? Is you're probably going to spend $100, maybe $2 on a deck to, if you're going to play EDH regularly and you want to be competitive with people at, your local game store. And Cube, again, you have total control over the environment. You could just take cards that are from the penny bin and put them in a cube, and that's what everyone is forced to play with. The power level, the everything is determined by you.
Yeah, you touched on something really critical about how Cube is unique from other formats, which is if you're playing a constructed format, let's say there's a 3-mana white creature and you need to have the best one. If that's sort of the slot in the deck, you need to have the best one to play competitively. But there are a ton of options, and only that top one is going to be driven by the market of that constructed format. The second best one is going to be a lot cheaper, and it's fine to put in your cube because you don't have the same restriction of actually needing to play the best version. And, take that to the burn spell you want and the removal spell. You can always take this second tier, and because it's a closed system, it's not worse off in the way that a constructed game would be.
Yeah, it's something else interesting I think you've mentioned in some recent episodes of your podcast. Obviously, in a constructed format, you are forced to take the sort of best possible option, but sometimes the sort of lower power options, they can sort of offer more interesting choices, as it were.
Definitely.
Yeah,
or they can be sort of more, yeah.
I'm a huge fan of 3-mana red burn spell with set mechanic.
Was it one of the convention cards? It was Bear with set mechanic or something. Was the
Mr. Booster playtest cards, right?
That's the one, yeah. And another sort of, I guess, a point on budget as well is they're getting reasonably popular now, aren't they? Sort of, you got pauper cubes, all commons, peasant cubes, just sort of commons and uncommons.
Yeah. Although I will say that a lot of pauper cubers end up pipping out their whole pauper cube, but a fully foil pauper cube is not cheap. that gets pretty expensive. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that power level and rarity and cost are strictly connected to each other, but there is a correlation certainly. So if you want to be budget conscious, you can choose to be budget conscious by focusing on commons only, because for the most part, commons are going to be cheaper, but there are some very expensive ones that exist. Or you can also say, I'm going to play with a bunch of rares. There's a butt ton of 10-cent rares out there, and if that's what you like, then you could definitely build a really cheap cube that is nothing but rares and mythics. Just play with all those cards that don't have a home anywhere else.
Yeah, that could be quite fun, I guess, like sort of random 10 pence rare cube. Like it's just all the sort of,
right,
sort of junk rares, as it were.
Stuff that costs 4 mana or more that doesn't have a place in EDH, basically. It's the budget for that cube.
I think that also just is one of the great whole features of Cube that we've been sort of talking about and circling around, is that, there's some rare that I drafted and I really enjoyed in that one Dominaria draft deck, but it just doesn't have a home anywhere else. And so giving those 10-cent rares a place where they can actually shine is one of the things that Cube can do that really no other format can.
Ooh, I am tempted now. Interesting you say Dominaria. I think I might have mentioned this in one of my videos. As Mishra's Self-Replicator is a card that I absolutely love. And I'm wondering, I think that would be definitely a fun pet card to build around for a cube.
I'm going to look up that one right now, too. I don't know that one.
Oh, yeah, so that's
5 mana 2/2. Whenever you cast an artifact, you can pay 2 to clone it.
Oh, yeah, okay,
that's right.
That one.
And then the clone can also clone it, so you sort of like just exponentially, I mean, you'd need the mana to pour into them, you just exponentially grow and just have a whole board full of replicators replicating themselves and again, and it's... Oh.
I think I got to do that one time, and it was a lot of fun.
My sad story is I had someone else, I forget if they in Bolus's clutches it off me, but
no.
I had a replicator and it got nicked, and then they did the cool fun going off thing with the card that I put in.
They got to have your fun. No, that's not fair.
Exactly. And finally, we'll go on to our sort of last thing now, because this is something I've been trying to do. I'll tell you the difficulty I've been having with this slightly. So if you've been playing the game for a while, you can make a cube with cards you've got lying around. This is another one of these sort of final two where I'm not sure if it's a misconception or not, because I've tried quite a lot to sort of make, like, I'll design a cube with just stuff I've got lying around. But what I tend to find is I'll get like some ideas for some sort of, I want to build out. And then I'll sort of go, oh, but I don't have the cards to build that out. I'll need to sort of go and order these online. And then before I know it, I've built up sort of quite a large shopping list of things I need to buy online. And so I'm no longer sort of building it from stuff I have lying around. Like I've racked up.
This is the same answer, I think, to Anthony's budget question, where it's like, you absolutely can build a cube from just cards you have lying around, but you won't. Magic can be cheap, but it also isn't. Like, you're going to spend money on it. And I think that's how it works with cube design, too, right? Like, I think, especially if you've, been playing Magic for a while, you have, like, a decent pile of cards that are chaff that you're not using for anything else. It's an interesting design challenge to go through there and design a cube with just that limitation. And there's a lot of players out there that can make a lot of really interesting and dynamic and fun cubes just doing that. The reality is, like, Magic is a game where you're aware of a lot of other cards and there's a lot of moving pieces and connected parts. You're going to look at that and say, I wish I had a
right. You
opt
say,
or
oh,
whatever.
I have this sort of theme is starting to come together, but I know that there's this card that exists that I just don't have, and so you're going to want to do that.
You're going to want it. You're going to want it, and you can ignore that desire and say, nope, sorry, it's not my rule. I have to like have it in my junk box. But the reality is, like, you probably won't. You will probably find some cards where you're like, I really wish I had a couple of these. That would really bring the room together, and then you can get them or not.
But I mean, Magic is a game with a ton of cards. Designing from the full, 23,000 cards is a lot of flexibility and a lot of fun. If we talk about the budget, you're cutting out, a few percentages of the cards that are actually worth money, but there's still a ton of design space. And then if you go to the cards that you have, that's yet another smaller card pool, but there's still a ton of design space potentially there. So I think it absolutely is possible if you're willing to commit to keeping your TCG player cart empty.
It is really satisfying, I think. My wife is actually in the process of building her first cube, and she's largely doing it with cards that are both in mine and Anthony's collections that are just kind of sitting around that we're not doing anything with, and it's very satisfying. Yeah, she's like, can I take this card? I'm like, of course. Like, it's just sitting in a box. Take the card. Play with it. Magic cards want to be played with, and it's very satisfying for them to get another life.
So yeah, no, because I actually I sort of made a little spreadsheet. I got all my cards, sort of logged them all in a spreadsheet, sort of wrote some themes which they play into. But then my problem is I am always tempted. Like I can't leave that sort of TCG player cart empty, and I always have to sort of pick some other things up to sort of fill it all out.
It is important to remember that Magic is largely successful and designed to make you want to buy more cards. That is why the game has continued to succeed as a business, and it's part of what Magic is. It's a game that just kind of sucks you in, and you could be aware of that, I think, at least.
Yeah. But regardless, even if you get together half, maybe 70% of a cube, and you're only buying the last 30%, that can still save you a lot of effort and time and budget.
It could save that cart optimizer a lot of cycles. That thing really churns a lot on a huge cart.
Yeah. All right. Thanks very much. Just one final thing here. Actually, this wasn't on the sort of list, but it is something that's come up sort of since I sent it out. What are your thoughts, you two? I know some stores, they'll offer sort of, you can get a starter cube or something. It'll be maybe $180 or something, and they'll sort of have a cube which they'll sort of send along for you. What are your sort of thoughts on those?
I think getting a cube, I think it's great. I think you'll know if it's a product you want, and it's probably for people that mostly want to draft and play and don't care as much about designing a cube, or maybe have no collection and do want to start designing a cube, but rather than starting from absolute scratch, it's easier to start from a baseline and make changes and additions and cuts. Those are the people it's right for. I do think that it's important to acknowledge that those stores are largely doing that as a means to like sell a bulk they have a bunch of.
Yeah.
And I think the design process of those cubes is some percentage, how can we make this a reasonable environment, and also a big percentage of what do we have a lot of that we're trying to get rid of. And so that's the thing to acknowledge about that. And you're paying a premium for it if you want to do that. But it's, I think, a great place to start if for people that just want an out-of-the-box cube and just want to start drafting. Absolutely a great product for that. If design is what you're interested in, probably not the best place to start, especially if you have a collection. Just take the cards you've got and make your own starter cube,
Yeah. So I suppose, they've got a place, definitely, but you just sort of bear all that in mind, as it were.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you both very much for your time. This has been great. Like I said, I feel I've learned a lot.
Can I add one more misconception, which you didn't touch on, which you actually think is maybe after the power level one, the most important misconception about Cube?
Oh, go. Yeah, definitely.
This is one of the ones I think keeps people from playing Cube the most, and that is just that the misconception that you need 8 players to draft a Cube. I think, that's the standard booster draft. A lot of cubes are designed to be drafted with 8 players, but you absolutely do not need 8 players to draft a cube. I have played way more 2-player cube drafts in my life than full 8-player pods, for sure. You can do it with 4, you can do it with 6, you can do it with odd numbers too. It's also possible. There's lots of different draft formats that we have actually got a page on our website that documents these. At some point, when we're more happy with that page, we'll probably do a whole episode about different draft formats or different numbers of players. But if that is the thing that is keeping you from playing Cube, you're like, I only have 1 friend that I play with or 3 friends that I play with, that is not a barrier either. You can play Cube in lots of different formats with lots of different numbers of people. And frankly, I think it's actually sometimes more fun. I really love 1v1 Cube drafts. Just a couple of draft formats I think are great for 1v1. And because there's only 2 of you, it goes so much faster. You're not waiting for people to make picks and packs. You're not waiting for matches to finish. You just get to draft and play constantly. And it's a ton of fun. So that, I would add, is another very important misconception, especially for the edited version of this video. Just get that in there, that you don't need to have, you don't need 8 people to draft a cube.
Is that also then, with those cubes, do you do sort of Winston drafting or auction or quilt, or what sort of draft methods do you use for that?
My favorite for 2 players is grid draft, though there's a new format, which I don't know, I can't remember the name off the top of my head. It's gaining in popularity, where you have a pack of cards, and you put cards back on the table. There's a bunch of them, again, on our website you should check. But I love...
It's Houseman?
Yeah, Houseman I think is what it is. So I like grid or Houseman for 2-player draft formats. For 6, I love team draft. For 4, I really love, though Anthony doesn't love this one as much, a format where you basically each player drafts 2 decks simultaneously, and then you have 2 decks and you play them against your opponent's 2 decks when you pair up in a match. And then for other numbers, it's just basically those same formats, but like with different pack sizes or, things like that. Those are my favorite ways to draft.
That's a huge point that can be easily missed if you're just, familiar with booster drafting. When you're drafting a cube, the packs aren't pre-sealed, so you can just change the number. And so doing 4 packs of 11 or 5 packs of 9 with a group of 4 players actually is a really great way to draft, and it feels much more like an 8-player pod.
The other thing is that the oldest 2-player draft formats were also designed for booster packs, and as a result, they were trying to limit the number of booster packs you had to buy to do the draft format. So the draft pools were still pretty small. So if you look at like Winston or whatever, that was designed for like each player brings 3 packs, and that's a reasonable number to buy to like go to a draft, or maybe it's 6 packs. And when you have a cube, though, there's nothing to say the draft pool can't be enormous. Let's draft the whole cube with 2 of us with some format where we ignore most of the packs or burning most of the cards, or we're doing a big grid draft and most of the cards don't get picked, which means you can still have a very powerful, very focused deck without having to worry about buying a bunch of booster packs to make a big draft happen.
And also, talking about drafting methods, I know this is one... I don't know if it's necessarily true you want to stay with like sort of sealed, I guess. That would be less interesting possibly on lots of these just because, you're just getting your cards. There's not necessarily the sort of drafting experience you're getting through that, or...
I have occasionally played sealed with cube. You of course can. I do think it's less fun. I think drafting is really fun and a big part of why I like limited. So I'll draft whenever I can. And really, there are so many good draft formats for different numbers of players that I just don't find myself having to fall back on sealed basically ever. So
I enjoy sealed. It's definitely very, very different because a lot of cubes are very highly synergistic. If you're considering, here's your draft pool and it's got Goblin Guide and it has Wrath of God, I don't really want those in the same deck, which doesn't happen as much or to the same degree with sealed booster packs where it's like, cool, I have a blue 2/3 and a blue 4/2. Sure, I'll put them in the same deck because like they still are creatures, their bodies, they do stuff. But that's not to say you can't actually design a cube intended to be played with sealed, where there's slightly
that was
less
our second ever podcast episode.
Synergy and maybe some bigger power outliers that sort of draw you and direct the way that you're designing your sealed deck. It's definitely possible.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I think actually one of the bigger problems with sealed and cube is that for a given sealed pool, there are probably like a bunch of different combinations of decks that are like within a rounding error of each other, the same power level. Because again, most cubes are flatter power level, and so you're not gonna have like. I really like normal retail seal because it's like, all right, I open these, let's say 4 bombs, right? Like I have, these 4 rares or mythic rares that are actually very powerful that are like draws to be playing them. Which combination of these can I reasonably play in my deck? And, what kind of removal do I have to support them? Like solving that puzzle, I think is fun. With most cubes, or many cubes at least, when you open up a sealed pool, it's like, all right, I've got, I now have a ton of playable cards in all these colors. And it's just a matter of like, which of these color pairs do I want to play to make this deck work, because you can probably make a viable deck out of any combination of those colors pretty much.
Yeah, so I suppose, just because of the higher quality of sort of, powerful stuff in cube would make it harder to do sealed in a cube than in sort of retail, say.
You just don't have those like strong pulls to be like, I really want to play this mythic rare I open because it's like 4 times better than every other card in my pool and every card in my opponent's pools for the most part. So like, how can I make this card work in my deck? In cube, you're mostly like, well, it's mostly flatter power level, so I'm like, I've got these 16 or 20 cards that are like maybe slightly better than average. They're across all the colors. My opponent's going to have the same kind of decisions to make, and it ends up being like, for example, I think if you're optimizing cube sealed, you very often would sideboard into a completely different deck in match 2. You'd be like, all right, well, I built my deck, which I thought was good, but that you're playing this, I'm now going to sideboard into aggro. I'm going to sideboard into control and just switch all my cards out.
Completely different, yeah.
And that's not particularly fun. And to come back to what we've been saying this entire time, if the environment is not fun to optimize competitively, then that's a big strike against it as a fun game. And so that's, I think, why cube sealed ends up being not that popular.
Oh, I forget if I heard this from you guys or heard this elsewhere. Isn't there some idea that like people can optimize the fun sort of out of situations? Like if the fun thing isn't the optimal thing, then people will do the optimal thing and it'll be less fun.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you need not look far. No, good gracious, you need not look further. Look no further than Legacy, where people are just like turn 1 in Blood Moon. Like turn 1 Blood Moon is not fun for anybody. No one likes that.
Some people like that.
I mean, some people just like winning and having their opponent do nothing is fun for them. But like that is, I think, a pretty objectively not a very interesting game. But people do it because it's powerful, right? Like it is powerful to have some red deck that can turn 1 Blood Moon and your opponent's deck now does nothing. Haha. And so they're forced to do that because it's a competitive format.
You just did that in the Degenerate Microcube yesterday, and you had a great time. You had such a grin saying, "My opponent casts 0 spells."
Well, first of all, I had to work for that. I had to work to get 3 Thorns of Amethyst in play on the second turn of the game. And second of all, that's what that environment is about. Everybody's doing that. There are some fair decks in Legacy that are just like, boo-hoo, you happen to have Blood Moon in your opening hand. Anyway, point being, yes, I think you should not expect your players to be trying to do the fun thing. You should always expect your players to be trying to win.
Don't expect them to be bringing their own fun.
Yeah.
I think that would really be the log line that I would give to Cube. Is it is the way that you can play Magic that captures everything that's wonderful about kitchen table Magic, while you can still optimize it.
Yeah. Because I've heard it described, certainly high power levels, it's sort of like, it's limited, but kind of constructed as well, sort of brought together, because like the decks you will be building are sort of, more constructed tier power level, I guess, than Liter Limited would be.
Yeah, I don't love that comparison, because I feel like it's basically just saying it's limited with constructed cards, which is kind of what people are getting at. Like, I don't actually think it's fundamentally not limited in any way. Like, it's entirely limited. It's people only make that comparison because the decks are powerful and they're playing with cards that are played in constructed formats. But everything about it is limited, and I don't particularly like constructed, and I love Cube. So take that for what you will.
Perhaps that's a misconception that I've fallen prey to myself there. Were there any other last misconceptions I might have missed out? Are you guys wanting to flag up here, or shall we call it this?
The last one for me. I think we pretty much covered everything, which is basically the one misconception of Cube has to be one way, and it doesn't.
So that's the one big thing. Just to reiterate, I suppose the big point, like I was saying at the start, Cube is not just about playing all the most powerful cards. It's about playing, your pet cards, the cards you want to play. So take that one big lesson away.
Yeah, it's taking the huge pile of what Magic can be, the giant big tent that contains every single type of Magic ever played on the face of planet Earth, and saying, what are the things that I care about most? What are the parts of this game that I love and want to emphasize and play the most with my friends?
Yeah, brilliant. That's you've hit the nail on the head there. So thanks both very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.